The stage came in from the east, with the sun behind it, and the man on the porch saw her shape against the light before he saw her face. He laughed once, short and mean, and called across the yard so the hands at the barn could hear. "Best stay out of the fields, ma'am. Boards might not hold you." Augusta Whitmore stepped down from the stage with one hand on the rail and the other holding the carpetbag that had everything she owned in it. She did not flinch. She did not answer. She did not look at him. She set the bag in the dust beside her boot, smoothed the front of her traveling dress where the road had wrinkled it, and waited for the driver to hand down her trunk. The driver was a kind man who had not said a word the whole way out from the rail spur, and he set the trunk down gently as a sleeping child, and tipped his hat to her and climbed back up. The stage rolled on. The dust settled. The porch laughter sputtered and went out, because nobody had joined in, and the man who had spoken found he was the only one with his mouth open. Augusta lifted the bag. She walked across the yard toward the house with the slow, level walk of a woman who has been walked at, jeered at, and stared at her whole life, and learned that the only answer is to keep your feet under you and your eyes on the door. She was 36 years old that summer. She was 5 feet 8 inches tall and weighed 260 pounds. And she carried it the way some women carry lamplight in a windy room, both hands, careful, refusing to let it go out. And something inside her cracked open. If this story already has your chest tight, do me one small favor. Hit that subscribe button and follow Augusta's story all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far Augusta's story travels. Hollis Creek lay in a long, shallow bowl of land in the territory in the summer of 1885, with the wheat ripening in 40-acre squares, and the creek running thin and clear out of the eastern hills. The Calder homestead sat at the south end of the bowl, 160 acres of wheat and pasture and a small herd of red cattle, the irrigation channel cutting straight from the creek to the near field and then bending out to the far one. The house was a plain white two-story with a porch that ran the front, and a kitchen wing that had not been opened in 2 years. The barn was bigger than the house. The bunkhouse leaned. The dog under the porch did not bother to come out. The door opened before Augusta reached the steps, and the man who stood in it did not flinch. She had braced for it. She always braced for it. The first look was the worst. The small, involuntary tightening around a stranger's eyes, the quick down and up, the polite mask sliding into place a half-second too late. She had counted that half-second 1,000 times. She had learned to fill it with her own steady silence, so the stranger had nothing to push against. Holt Calder gave her none of it. He looked at her the way a man looks at weather, plainly and without comment, and stepped back to let her in. "Mrs. Whitmore." "Miss," she said, "I was married. He's gone." "Miss Whitmore, then. Come inside." He was tall and lean in the way men get who have been doing the work of 3 for too long, with the dark circles of a man who slept 4 hours and called it a night. His shirt had been ironed by his own hand, and the iron had been too cool. There was hay in the cuff of his trousers. He was 38 or 39, she thought, and the gray at his temples was new gray, not earned gray. The kind grief puts there in a hurry. She stepped past him into a front room that had been kept the way a man keeps a room he does not live in. The chairs were straight, the lamp was wiped. A clock ticked on the mantel that had no business still running, and she knew, without asking, that he wound it every Sunday. Because his wife had wound it every Sunday, and he had not been able to stop. He cleared his throat. He did not look at the room. He looked at the floor between them. "There's a contract," he said. "I'll lay it out plain. Room above the kitchen, your own. Wages of $4 a week, and your board. You run the house. You cook for me and the hands, there's 9 of them when the crew comes. 4 right now. You keep the books if you can read figures. I'm getting the wheat in. I won't be in the house much these next 2 weeks. After harvest we can talk about whether it suits. It suits, she said. He looked up at that. He had expected her to need a minute. He had expected her to ask about the wages, or the room, or what the books look like. She had not. She had said the 2 words, and then stood there with her bag in her hand the way a woman stands when she has already decided. All right, he said. He took a key from a nail beside the door. It was a small iron key, old, and there was a thread of red yarn tied through the bow of it. He held it out to her in the flat of his palm, like it weighed more than it did. Kitchen's been closed 2 years, he said. I haven't been in it. I don't go in it. You'll find it, however, she left it. I'd be obliged if you didn't tell me about it. I won't. All right. He did not say his wife's name. He did not need to. The name was in the room with them already, the way the clock was, the way the cool iron on his shirt was. Augusta took the key and closed her hand around it and felt the red yarn against her palm. And she understood, without being told, that the yarn had been tied there by a woman who had liked color in small places. Mr. Calder, she said. Holt, where do I put my trunk? Tate'll bring it up. Tate, he raised his voice without turning his head. Trunk to the room above the kitchen. There was a silence from the porch. Then a slow, insolent yes, sir, and the sound of boots coming off the rail. Holt's mouth moved a fraction. It was not a smile. It was the place a smile would have been on a face that had forgotten the root. He's young, Holt said. He'll learn or he won't, Augusta said. Either way, the supper'll be on the table at 6 o'clock. Holt looked at her again, that plain weather look, and this time something in it shifted half an inch. He nodded once and went out past her toward the barn, and she stood in the front room of a stranger's house, with a key in her hand, and the clock ticking on the mantel, and she let her shoulders come down an inch, because no one was looking. The kitchen door was at the end of a short hall, behind the dining room. There was a film of dust on the knob. There was a sprig of dried lavender, nailed above the lintel that someone had put there a long time back, and no one had taken down. Augusta set her carpet-bag on the floor in the hall and put the key in the lock and turned it, and the bolt slid with the small, reluctant sigh of a thing that had been waiting. The kitchen smelled of cold ash and dried herbs, and the faint, sweet-sour ghost of bread that had been baked there 1,000 times, and then not at all. The stove was black and cold. The flour barrel had its lid on, sealed with a strip of wax cloth somebody had pressed careful around the rim. There were 2 loaves of bread on the table under a cloth, gone hard as stone 2 winters back and never moved. The teapot stood on the warming shelf with the lid set crooked, the way a busy woman sets a lid she means to come back to in a minute. The dishcloth was folded on the rail by the pump. The apron was on the hook. There was a wooden spoon laid across a bowl on the work table, as though she had stepped out to ask her husband a question and meant to come right back. Augusta stood in the doorway and let the room be what it was for a long minute. She did not cry. She had not cried in a kitchen since she was 12 years old, and she was not going to start in another woman's. She thought, this is a held breath. She thought, somebody has been holding this breath 2 years and it is mine now. Then she rolled her sleeves to the elbow. She took the hard loaves out to the chickens and broke them up in the yard so they could be useful one more time. She lifted the cloths off the table and shook them out the back door. She took down the apron and put it on, and it was tight at her waist, and she did not let that matter. She tied it where it tied. She opened the flour barrel and looked in, and the flour was sound. The wax cloth had done its work. She checked the lard tin. She checked the salt. She found a smoked ham in the cellar, wrapped in muslin, and a crock of butter sunk in the cool stream box, and onions strung in the lean-to, and a sack of dried beans she set to soak before she did anything else. She built a fire in the stove with the kindling that had been laid against the day someone came back, and she fed the fire the way her father had taught her. Small to large, never crowding. And when the iron began to tick, she rubbed the cooktop down with a piece of bacon rind and watched the smoke rise blue. By the time the 4 hands came in from the near field at sundown, there was cornbread cooling on the rail and beans in the pot and ham fried with onions and a pan of stewed apples she had found a jar of in the cellar, and the smell coming out of the kitchen wing of the Calder homestead was a smell that had not come out of it in 2 years. The men stopped in the yard. One of them took his hat off without thinking. They all looked toward the kitchen, and then at each other, and then they came up onto the porch quieter than they had come up onto a porch in a long time. Augusta set the table in the dining room because the dining room was where they had eaten before, and the chair at the head she set with the same care as the others, and no special fuss. She put out plates. She put out the bread. She brought the pot and the platter through. She did not sit. She stood at the sideboard with her hands folded in front of her apron, and she waited for them to come in. Holt came in last. He had washed at the pump, and his hair was wet and combed flat. He saw the table, and he stopped in the doorway, and Augusta watched a thing go across his face that he did not have words for. He found his chair. He sat down. He did not look at the empty chair at his right hand, and Augusta did not look at it either, and neither of them said anything about it. Tate came in, with his hat still on, and dropped into a seat and reached for the bread. One of the older hands cleared his throat, and Tate looked up and saw the older hand looking at his hat, and after a sullen second he took it off and hung it on the back of his chair. "We say grace in this house," Holt said quietly. "Since when?" Tate said. "Since tonight. It was not loud, it was not even much of a rebuke, but it landed the way a small stone lands in a still pond, and the older hands did not look up from their plates." Holt said a few short words over the food, and the men said amen, and they ate. They ate like men who had not eaten properly in 2 years. They did not talk. The only sounds were the click of forks and the small wet sound of beans and the creak of a chair when somebody shifted to reach. Augusta refilled the bread plate twice. She refilled the bean pot once. She did not sit. She did not eat. She stood at the sideboard, and she watched the level of the food go down, and she watched the hunch come out of the older men's shoulders 1 inch at a time, and she thought, this is the work. This is the first day of the work. And Pate finished his plate and pushed it away and leaned back in his chair. "Pass them apples," he said, to no one in particular, and Augusta brought him the dish of apples and set them at his elbow, and he said, without looking up, "I expect the boards in the kitchen are creaking tonight." He said it half under his breath. He said it so the man next to him would hear it and laugh. The man next to him did not laugh. The man next to him put his fork down very carefully and looked at his plate. Augusta refilled the man's water glass. She did not look at Tate. She did not speak. She walked back to the sideboard and folded her hands in front of her apron, and she did not flinch, and she did not smile, and she did not cry. Because she had been here before, in this exact chair, in 100 kitchens, and she had learned a long time ago that the only place a remark like that could live was in the mouth that said it. If she did not pick it up, it stayed there. If she did not pick it up, it rotted there. Holt set his coffee cup down. He did not look at Tate. He looked at his own plate. "Tate," he said, "you'll thank Miss Whitmore for the supper before you leave this table." "Yes, sir," out loud. Tate's neck went red. He looked at his apples. He chewed the inside of his cheek. After a long second he said, "Thank you for the supper, ma'am." And it was sullen, but it was out loud, and Augusta inclined her head a quarter-inch in his direction and said, "Plain as bread. You're welcome, Mr. Tate." And that was the end of it. Holt did not look up, but he set his cup down a little differently. When he picked it up again, Augusta saw it. After the men went out to the bunkhouse, she cleared the table herself. She would not let the older hand, who tried to help carry a single plate. She sent him to bed instead, and he went, blinking, as though he had been told something kind, in a language he had not heard in a long time. She washed up at the pump in the dark. She wiped the table and set the chairs straight. She put away the bread under a fresh cloth and banked the stove. She took the apron off and hung it back on the hook exactly where she had found it, because the apron belonged to the kitchen and not to her. Then she went out the back door into the cooling yard and walked the fence line of the near field by herself. The wheat stood thick and high in the last of the day's blue. She walked along the fence and let her hand brush the heads, and the heads were heavy and dry to her palm, and the kernels, when she rolled them between her thumb and finger, came out of the husk with the small, clean snap of grain that was ready and would not wait. She bent and crumbled a handful of the soil at the edge, and the soil crumbled too dry. The irrigation had not run on this field in a week, maybe longer. She walked 20 paces along the channel that bordered the field, and looked down into it, and stopped. The channel had not weathered shut. The channel had been knocked in. The collapse was clean. The bank had been cut from above with a spade and pushed down in a section maybe 4 feet long, and the cut was fresh enough that the broken edges had not yet grayed in the air. She stood and looked at it for a long minute. Then she straightened and walked back to the house. Holt was on the porch with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand. He had been waiting for her without admitting to himself he was waiting. He looked up when she came around the corner of the house, and she came up the steps and stood at the rail and did not sit. 11 days, she said. What? The wheat. It needs to come down in 11 days, not 15. You've got rust starting on the south edge. The heads are heavier than they look. Any wind over 20 will lay a third of it down, and if you get a hot, dry week, the kernels will shatter on the stem before the cradles get to them. 11 days. Holt was quiet a long second. My foreman said 15. Your foreman is wrong. She said it without heat. She said it the way a doctor says a leg is broken. He looked at her then properly in the lamplight from the front room window, and she let him look. She did not turn her face away. She did not pull her shoulders in. He looked at her, and she watched him not flinch, and she thought with a small dry surprise that surprised her more than she wanted to admit, he does not flinch. All right, he said, and the channel above the near field has been cut. Not weathered, cut. A spade, 4 feet, in the last week. That's why the south edge is drying faster than it ought. He set the cup down on the rail very slowly. You sure? I'm sure. All right, he rubbed his face with one hand. Tomorrow I'll look at it. There's a stake at the creek bend that wasn't there a week ago either, I'd guess. His head came up at that. How do you know? I don't, but there is one. I saw it walking the fence. A surveyor's stake with a red ribbon on it, set in the bank where your channel takes off. Did you have a survey out? No, then somebody else did. Holt looked out across the dark yard toward the creek. He could not see. The muscle in his jaw moved once. He did not say anything for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had gone quieter, not louder, the way a careful man's voice goes when he is angry under it. 11 days, he said. 11. Thank you, Miss Whitmore, Augusta. He looked at her again. Augusta, he said. Good night, Holt. Good night. She went up the kitchen stair to the room above it, and closed the door behind her, and stood with her back to the door, and breathed out, and only then, Only in the dark of the small clean room with its narrow bed and its little window over the yard did she let her hand come up. She did not cry. She had not in fact cried since the man she had been married to had been buried. And she did not see any reason to start in a stranger's house above a stranger's kitchen. But she pressed her hand flat against the bone there, and let it rest a moment. Because the day had been long, and a man had not flinched at the door, and those two facts together took a kind of accounting. Then she lit the lamp, and she opened her trunk, and she put her things away. The harvest crew did not come the next day. Holt rode out at first light to the supply company in town, and rode back at noon, with his mouth tight as a closed seam. "Marsh's man," he said when he came up the porch steps, and Augusta brought him a cup of water without being asked, had been very sorry. There had been a delay. There had been a sickness among the hired men. There had been a wagon broken on the road. The crew would come the next day. The crew would come for certain the day after. The crew would come. "The crew will not come," Augusta said. Holt drank the water. He looked at the bottom of the cup. "No," he said. "I don't think they will." She did not ask the obvious question. She let him sit with it. She went back into the kitchen and started bread, because bread was the thing you started when you did not have answers, and the act of pushing flour and water and salt together with the heel of your hand was the act of putting one foreseeable thing into a day that otherwise had no foreseeable things in it. She went out at mid-morning and walked the channel above the near field herself with a spade. She walked the section that had been cut. She walked another quarter-mile up and found a second cut, smaller, more recent, where the channel turned through a stand of willow. She came back and made a note of both in pencil at the back of the kitchen ledger, with the date, the location, and the length of the cut in feet. She did not show the ledger to anyone. She put it back on its shelf above the work table, and she went on with the bread. The third day, the surveyor's stake at the creek bend acquired a brother 50 yards downstream with the same red ribbon. The fourth day, a man in a town coat rode along the road on a sorrel horse without turning his head, and rode on past. And Augusta watched him go from the kitchen window, and did not move from the window until the dust of him was out of sight. On the fifth day, Holt came in from the south field at dusk, and washed at the pump and came in for supper, and Augusta set his plate in front of him, and his face under the lamplight was the gray of a man who had carried too much for too long without telling anyone. He ate 2 bites. He set the fork down. "How are the books?" he said. "They're being kept. Show me." She brought him the ledger. He turned the pages slowly, and Augusta watched him stop on the first page. She had balanced. He did not say anything for a long minute. The numbers down the right margin ran clean and even in her hand. The numbers above them in the columns ran in another hand, careful and a little old-fashioned. The loops of the 8s closed neat. The 7s crossed in the European way. He had not been able to balance them. He had not been able to look at them. They had sat unfinished for 2 years like the rest of the house, and now they sat finished, in another woman's pencil, and the 2 hands met clean at the bottom of the column. He closed the ledger. He put his hand flat on the cover. "Thank you," he said. "It's the job." "It's more than the job." She did not answer. She took the ledger back and put it on its shelf. Tate did not stop. Tate had a small, mean talent, and he kept up its practice. He asked at the table whether the bench in the bunkhouse had been reinforced. He asked when she set down a platter whether she had built the platter herself out of barrel staves to carry the load. He said it half under his breath. He said it where the older hands could hear and pretend not to. He was 20 years old, and he had grown up on a farm 2 valleys over where there had been a stepmother who had whipped him for breathing, and he had decided early that the way to survive a world that hit you was to hit something else first. And Augusta knew this about him because she had grown up with 3 brothers of that exact same flavor, and she had learned that the only thing that helped was time and refusal and the slow, patient pressure of being treated, day after day, as a person who did not deserve to be hit. She refilled his water. She passed him the bread. She said good morning to him at the door. She did not ever give him the thing he was trying to get. On the 5th night, Holt heard him say something. Augusta did not catch the words. She had been at the sideboard, and the words had been said into a fork. But she saw Holt's head come up, and she saw his hand stop on the way to his cup, and she saw him look at Tate for one long, flat second. And Tate's face went the color of a brick. "You'll eat in the bunkhouse tomorrow night," Holt said. "And the night after. And until I tell you different." "Yes, sir. You'll thank Miss Whitmore now for tonight's supper. And then you'll go." "Yes, sir." Tate stood. He looked at his plate. He looked for the first time in 5 days, straight at Augusta's face. There was nothing soft in his look. There was only a young man caught out in front of his elders, and his mouth was a hard line. "Thank you for the supper, ma'am." "You're welcome, Mr. Tate." He went. The door closed behind him. The older hands ate quietly. Holt did not say anything else. He finished his coffee. He stood up. He came past the sideboard on his way out, and he stopped a half step. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't be. I am, though. All right." He looked at her with something that was almost a smile, and was not a smile. "You don't flinch," he said. "No, I never met anybody who didn't flinch. You're not most people either, Mr. Calder." It surprised him. He stood with his hand on the doorframe a second and looked at her, and his mouth opened a fraction the way a man's mouth opens when he is going to say something, and then realizes he does not have the sentence. He shook his head. He laughed once, soundless, a breath through the nose. "I'm not," he said. "I'm not most folks." He went out. Augusta took up the plates. She drove the wagon into town the next morning for sugar and coffee and a tin of yeast. The road into Hollis Creek ran along the creek a half-mile, and then climbed a low rise, and then dropped into a single dusty street with a livery at one end and a land office at the other, and a mercantile in the middle with a hand-painted sign that said, "Brands." The woman behind the counter was perhaps 55, narrow and straight-backed in a black dress, with the kind of silver bun that has been put up the same way every morning since 1860. Her eyes when Augusta came through the door were the eyes of a woman who had been watching the street for 30 years, and missed nothing that crossed it. Augusta gave her the list. Eleanor Brand read it, without comment. She set the sugar on the counter. She set the coffee. She set the tin of yeast. She did not call across to a boy to fetch any of it. She fetched it all herself, which Augusta noticed and tucked away. "You're at Calder's," Eleanor said. "I am. Holt eating. He is. The hands eating. They are." Eleanor's mouth moved at one corner. It was not a smile either. "That kitchen has been closed 2 years. It's open now, Augusta watched the figures go down, not the cost was small, but the date and the name Calder, and the word "open" beside it as though it were a fact in a ledger of facts. Mary Calder was a friend of mine. She used to come in on Tuesdays. She kept a kitchen, the way some women keep a chapel. I can tell. You can. Eleanor looked up at her, then with a long appraising look that was not the look Augusta was used to. It was not the down and up. It was the look of a woman taking another woman's measure for use. "You'll do, thank you." "It's not a compliment, Miss Whitmore. It's a forecast." Augusta inclined her head. Eleanor wrapped the sugar. She wrapped the coffee. She set the yeast tin on top. She did not push the parcel across yet. She held it under her hand. She looked at the window where the dust of the street hung in a flat noonlight, and she spoke as though she were observing the weather. Mr. Marsh's survey company came into Hollis Creek the same month. Mary Calder died, she said. I noticed because the same week, his wagon broke a window of mine, and he refused to pay for it. He is a man who breaks things and does not pay. I would not like to see him acquire creek-fed land in this valley, because I have a long memory, and the memory of Mary Calder is in it. Do you understand me, Miss Whitmore? I understand you. Good. Eleanor pushed the parcel across. Tell Holt his credit is good with me until the wheat is in. Tell him I said so out loud. I will. And Miss Whitmore? Augusta paused at the door. There's a tin box, Eleanor said. Mary kept a tin box. I do not know where she kept it. I know she kept it. She told me once she kept it where the heat would not get to it, but where she could get to it without her husband seeing her. If you have run that kitchen a week, and you have not found it yet, find it. That's all I'll say. Augusta nodded once. She went out into the sun. She put the parcel on the wagon seat. She drove home with both hands on the reins, and her mind very still, the way her mind went, still, in front of a problem that was about to need her. That night she put the supper on the table, and she ate her own at the kitchen work table, standing up, because she was thinking and she always thought better on her feet. After she had washed up, she did not bank the stove right away. She took the lamp down off the rail, and she stood in the middle of the kitchen, and she looked at it, where the heat would not get to it, where she could get to it, without her husband seeing her. The stove sat against the back wall of the kitchen on a brick pad. Behind the stove, in the wall, was the chimney brick, and a narrow gap of perhaps 4 inches between the stovepipe and the wainscot. Augusta took the lamp and went around behind the stove and crouched, and she was a heavy woman. And the crouch was not easy. But she did it, and she held the lamp up to the gap behind the pipe, and looked. There was a tin box wedged on a little wooden ledge that had been nailed there for the purpose. It had a faded green paint and a brass clasp. It had been wedged with its short side out, the way a woman wedges a thing she means to be able to get to without her husband looking up from the table. Augusta worked it out with 2 fingers. She straightened slowly. She set the box on the work table and stood looking at it. Her heart was doing something quick and small under her breastbone, and she let it. She did not open the box for a long minute. She thought about Mary Calder, who she had never met, who had kept a kitchen like a chapel and a tin box like a sentry, and she said quietly, in a voice nobody else could hear, "All right, Mary. All right." She lifted the clasp. On top of everything else, there was a folded piece of paper, and it was a note in the same careful, old-fashioned hand that ran the 8s and 7s in the ledger, and the note began. If anyone ever questions the water, Augusta read the first line, and then she put the note back down on the box, and she put her 2 hands flat on the work table on either side. Off. And she breathed, once in and out. And she did not flinch. And she did not cry. And she did not call for Holt, because what was in this box was not a thing for tonight. What was in this box was a thing for the right moment. And the right moment had not come yet. The right moment, she understood without anyone telling her, was going to be put in front of her by Aldous Marsh himself. And when it came, she was going to need to be standing up straight with the box in her hands and her feet under her. She closed the box. She took it up the stair to her own room. She put it in the bottom of her trunk under her winter shawl. And she locked the trunk. And she put the key on the string around her neck, where the iron kitchen key already was. The 2 keys lay together against the bone of her chest, and Augusta Whitmore put her hand flat over both of them for one moment in the dark. Then she went back down and banked the stove for the night. The 6th day she walked the wheat again at first light. The south edge had darkened another shade. The rust was moving. The heads, when she rolled them, came apart cleaner now. 10 days, she thought. 9. If there is wind, she told Holt at breakfast. He nodded once. I rode the channel yesterday, he said. There's 3 cuts now. The newest was made the night before last. Somebody's coming onto the land in the dark. Somebody is. He looked at her across the rim of his coffee cup, and the look was the look of a man who had decided to say something he had not said in 2 years. My wife kept the books, he said. She kept the water filing. She told me, once she had put it, somewhere I would not lose it. I never asked her where, I figured I would. When I needed to, then she died. And I never went back in the kitchen, and I told myself I would find it, when I had to find it. I have not had to find it. I am beginning to think I am about to have to find it. All right. If you come across, he stopped. He set the cup down. If you come across anything of hers in the kitchen, I would be obliged. All right. She did not tell him about the box. Not yet. The box was hers tonight. Tomorrow, maybe, or the day after, when she had read every paper in it and knew what they said, she would put it in his hand. Tonight she was the only one who carried it, and she was steadier carrying it alone than she would be if she handed it over now and watched his face while he read. She went up after supper and unlocked the trunk, and took the box out, and put it on the bed. And she read the note all the way through by lamplight, with the door closed, and the key in the door, and her own breathing, the loudest thing in the room. The note was not long. Mary Calder had had a clear hand and a clear head, and she had written it the way a woman writes a thing. She means to be useful and not sentimental. If anyone ever questions the water, the note said, the original filing is in this box. It was filed by Holt's father in the spring of 1862, witnessed and notarized in Fort Bell by a Judge Harris, and the certificate is the bottom paper with the gold seal. The creek rights run with the deed. They cannot be severed without our signature. If a survey comes in claiming otherwise, the survey is wrong. I have been watching a company in town for some months that I do not trust. I have been keeping their notices, and what I can learn of their officers in the second envelope. If anything happens to me, Holt, give this to a county officer who is not from Hollis Creek, and not in their pocket. Give it to Mr. Bryce in Fort Bell if he is still assessor. He owes your father a favor from 1869, and he is the kind of man who remembers. I love you. Don't let them have the water. Monsieur Amour. Augusta sat on the edge of the bed with the note in her 2 hands, and she let her shoulders come down, and she let her breath come down, and she did not cry, but her eyes got hot at the rims. And she let them, because no one was there to see, and Mary Calder, 2 years dead, was in the room with her in a way that no person 2 years dead has any business being in a room. All right, Mary, she said again, quietly, all right. She put the note down. She unfolded the bottom paper carefully. The 1862 filing was there with the gold seal at the lower right, and the signature of a Judge Harris in faded brown ink, and the witness's name in a different hand, and the date in numerals, the 14th of April, 1862. The paper was thin and the fold lines were brown, but the seal was intact, the language was plain. The water rights ran with the deed. They could not be severed without the deed holder's signature. She read it twice. She put it back. The second envelope held a stack of newspaper clippings, and a single folded sheet that was she saw the incorporation papers of the Hollis Creek Survey Company, filed in the territorial capital in the autumn of 1883. The papers listed 3 officers and 1 silent partner. The silent partner was named on the last page in small clear print, Aldous Marsh, Hollis Creek. Beside that name, Mary Calder had drawn in pencil a single small star. Augusta put the papers back in the box. She closed the lid. She closed the clasp. She set the box on her bedside table because she was done hiding it from herself. She blew out the lamp. She lay on her back in the dark with her hand on the box, and she did not sleep for a long time. She slept finally near morning, and when she slept, she dreamed of a kitchen with the door open, and a woman at the stove, turning to her, and the woman's face was a face she did not know. And the woman said, plainly, "You'll do." When Augusta woke, the sky was the color of bruised iron. She knew it before she opened the window. She knew it from the way the light came under the curtain, flat, mineral, with no morning gold in it. She got up. She dressed. She went down the stair to the kitchen, and she stopped at the window over the sink and looked at the eastern sky. The clouds were piled along the ridge in long, flat ranks, dark blue-gray at the bottom, and the color of an old bruise at the top, and they were moving. Not fast, yet, but moving. There was a hot wind, low along the ground, that smelled of dust and far-off rain. She had grown up under skies like this. She knew what this sky meant. This sky meant 2 days, maybe less, and then a storm that would come down on the bowl of Hollis Creek and lay 40 acres of standing wheat down in mud, and there would be no crop, and there would be no money, and there would be no answer for the loan against the spring seed. She made coffee. She made it strong. She made it for a man who was going to need it. Holt came down in his work clothes already, hat in his hand, and he stopped at the window beside her without speaking. They stood together a long moment looking east. 2 days, he said, maybe less. I'll ride to town and put it out at the livery that I'll pay double for any man who'll swing a cradle. I'll ride to the supply company, and I will not leave until they put me on the day book for tomorrow's crew with names. I will get the crew, if I have to drag them by the collar. All right, you'll start the meals heavy. We'll work into the dark. All right. He looked at her. He set his hat on. He took the cup of coffee she held out to him, and drank it standing at the window. And then he set the empty cup on the sill, and he went out. And Augusta watched him cross the yard to the barn, watched him saddle the gray gelding he favored for town, watched him swing up and ride out the gate at a steady canter that ate the road. She watched until he was out of sight. Then she turned and went to work on the day. She was in the yard at the smokehouse around mid-morning, when she heard the horse coming in from the road too fast. She straightened. She put her hand up against the flat, strange light. The horse was the gray gelding, and the gelding was riderless and lathered, with its reins broken and its eyes white, and it slowed when it saw the barn, and it came in at a sideways jog, with the foam standing on its neck. Tate came around the corner of the barn at a run. He caught the gelding by the trailing rein and walked him in a tight circle to bring his head down. He looked across the yard at Augusta, and his face was the face of a young man who had not known until this moment that he could be afraid. "That's Mr. Calder's horse." "I know, that's his horse, and he's not on it." "I know." "And—" She went back into the kitchen and got her shawl off the hook and the small bag with the bandages and the bottle of carbolic from the shelf above the work table, and she came out and she said to Tate, in a voice that did not rise, "Hitch the wagon. Bring the bay. We are going to ride the road back, and we are going to find him." Move? Tate moved. He moved like a young man who has been waiting his whole short life to be told what to do by someone who knew. He had the wagon hitched in 3 minutes. He had the bay in the traces. He took the reins and Augusta climbed up onto the seat beside him. She was a heavy woman, and the wagon springs took her weight, with a sigh, and she did not let that matter. And Tate slapped the bay into a trot out the gate and onto the road that led to town. They found Holt a mile out, lying on his back in the dry grass at the edge of the road, with his left leg bent the wrong way below the knee and a gopher hole 8 feet behind him, with the gray's hoofcut still fresh in its rim. He was conscious. He was gray under his tan. He had bitten through his lower lip, keeping quiet, and there was a small thread of blood drying at the corner of his mouth. "Don't," he said when he saw her. "Don't move me till you splint it." "I won't." It's bad. I see it. She got down off the wagon. She knelt in the dust beside him, and she was steady, and Tate was at her shoulder, white-faced and useful, and she sent him for 2 boards from the wagon bed, and for the roll of clean cloth from the bag, and she splinted Holt's leg there in the road, with her own hands, the way her father had taught her, firm and even, and tied off with a square knot above and below the break. Holt did not make a sound. He bit through his lip again at the second tie, and Augusta took the corner of her own apron and wiped the blood off his mouth, and that was the only tenderness she allowed herself. And she allowed it because no one was looking, and because she had to. They lifted him into the wagon bed together, Tate at the shoulders and Augusta at the hips. The wagon springs took him with the same patient sigh they had taken her, and Tate climbed back up onto the seat and turned the bay for home, at a walk, because a trot would have killed Holt, and they both knew it. They were halfway back to the gate when the second horse came down the road from town at a hard canter, and Augusta turned in the seat and saw a man in a town coat on a sorrel horse. The same sorrel that had ridden past 4 days ago, without turning its head, pulling up alongside the wagon, and lifting his hat to her with the small dry politeness of a man who has been sent to deliver bad news and is enjoying it. "Miss Whitmore," he said, because he knew her name, which she noted. "I have a notice for Mr. Calder, from Mr. Marsh. Mr. Calder is in the wagon bed with a broken leg. You can hand it to me." He handed it to her. He did not get down. He sat his horse and watched her face while she unfolded the paper and read it. The paper was a survey notice from the Hollis Creek Survey Company, signed by Aldous Marsh as principal, stating that under the survey lately conducted on the parcels adjoining Hollis Creek, the water rights heretofore claimed by the Calder homestead were found to be unfiled, unrecorded, and therefore forfeit to the public domain as of Friday next, and that the creek would thereafter be administered by the survey company for the benefit of the valley, and that any diversion of water onto the Calder fields after Friday next would be regarded as trespass. Augusta read it twice. She folded it. She put it in her apron pocket. She looked up at the man on the sorrel horse. "Was there anything else, sir?" "No, ma'am." "Then good day." He touched his hat. He turned his horse. He went back up the road at a walk, and Augusta watched him go without moving, and Tate, on the seat beside her, said in a very small voice, "Ma'am, the crew's not coming, is it?" "No, Mr. Tate. The crew is not coming, ma'am. Drive." He drove. They came in through the gate at a walk. The hands came out from the barn and took the wagon, and they carried Holt up onto the porch and laid him on the long bench there, and Augusta unsplinted and resplinted the leg properly with the boards from the barn and a proper bandage, and Holt looked up at her once and said through his teeth, "No, Marsh, he says the water's forfeit Friday." "Augusta, I know." He closed his eyes. He breathed out. He opened his eyes again, and they were the eyes of a man who had stopped pretending, in the last hour, that he could do this alone. "You stay out of the field," he said. "You hear me? You stay out. There's 40 acres standing, and a storm 2 days off, and you cannot get that wheat down by yourself. Do you hear me?" "I hear you, Augusta. I hear you, Holt." She did not say yes. She did not say no. She wiped the sweat off his temple with her apron, and she stood up and she walked to the porch rail, and she looked out across the south field, at 40 acres of ripe wheat lying gold under a sky the color of a bruise, and the hot dry wind came across it and laid the heads in long flat waves. And behind her on the porch, a man she had known 6 days, and somehow already loved, was bleeding into the splint she had tied with her own hands, and in her apron pocket was a paper that said Friday, and against the bone of her chest under her dress the key to a trunk hung on a string, with the iron key of a dead woman's kitchen. And in the trunk, in her room above that kitchen, was a tin green box with a gold seal, and a list of names and a small pencil star. Tate came up the porch steps behind her. He stood at her shoulder. He did not speak for a long minute. When he spoke, his voice was a young man's voice, with all the meanness gone out of it. "Ma'am," he said, "what do you need?" Augusta did not turn around. She kept her eyes on the field. The wind moved across it again, and the wheat bowed and rose, and somewhere off to the east, a low, slow roll of thunder turned over in the belly of the cloud bank and turned over again. "Mr. Tate," she said, "saddle the bay. We have work to do before morning." She watched the wheat. She did not flinch. She did not cry. She did not for 1 second consider staying out of the field. Friday was 4 days off. The storm was 2. The crew was not coming. The man on the porch was hers to save, and so was the wheat, and so was the water. And Augusta Whitmore stood at the porch rail with her hand flat on the paper in her pocket, and the keys against her chest, and she understood, calmly and without fear, that this was not finished. This was beginning. Tate stood there another moment, waiting to be told something else. And when nothing else came, he went down the porch steps with his hat in his hand and crossed the yard toward the barn. Augusta watched him go. The boy who had told her, 3 weeks before, that the porch boards might not hold her, was walking now, with his shoulders pulled in and his head down, and she did not take any pleasure in it. There was no room in her for pleasure of that kind tonight. There was room only for the work. She went inside. The lamp in the front room was turned low, and she turned it up. Holt was on the cot. They had carried into the parlor because the stairs were beyond him with the leg the way it was. He lay with his head turned toward the window, and his eyes open, and the splint ran from his ankle to his hip in a long pale line under the quilt. He had not made a sound when they set the bone. He had bitten through a folded piece of leather, and his face had gone the color of skimmed milk, and he had not made a sound, and when it was done, he had said only, "Thank you, ma'am," in a voice like a man speaking from the bottom of a well. He was looking at her now, the same way he had looked at her then. "Augusta," he said, "I'm here. The notice, I have it. He means it. I know he means it." He closed his eyes. She thought he had gone under again from the laudanum the doctor had left, but after a moment he opened them and found her face. "The crew is not coming." "No, there's 40 acres. 42. A small sound came out of him that might have been a laugh, if the leg had not been what it was. 42. He said, "I walked it again this afternoon." "Augusta." "Yes. You cannot bring down 42 acres of wheat alone." "No," she said. "I cannot." He waited. "I am not going to be alone," she said. She had not lit the kitchen lamp yet. She went in now and lit it, and the room woke around her the way it had woken 3 weeks ago when she had first turned the key in that door. The long pine table, the row of tins on the shelf above the stove, the iron skillet hanging on its nail, the woman's apron still on its peg by the back door. The kitchen had been a held breath when she came to it. It was not a held breath anymore. It was a kitchen that had fed 9 men a supper every night for 21 nights, and would feed them again tomorrow if there were men to feed. She moved the kettle to the back of the stove and crouched down. The tin box was where she had put it that afternoon, behind the wood box, wrapped in a square of oilcloth she had taken from the pantry. She set it on the table. She washed her hands at the basin first. Her mother had taught her that. You did not handle paper with hands that had been in flour and lamp oil. You washed, and you dried, and then you opened the paper. She dried her hands on a clean cloth, and she sat down at the long pine table in the kitchen of a woman who had been dead 2 winters, and she opened the tin box. The note was on top. She had read it once already, standing at the stove with her heart going hard in her chest, and she read it again now slowly. Asterisk, if anyone ever questions the water. Asterisk, the dead woman had written in a careful schoolmistress hand. Asterisk, the original filing is under this letter. It is dated the 9th of June, 1862, and it was witnessed by my father, Josiah Lamb, and by Reverend Coombs, and it was notarized by the territorial clerk at Fort Bascom whose seal is on the back. Holt does not know I kept it. Holt does not know about a great many things I kept. The man you are looking for is named Marsh. He came to the door once and offered to buy the creek frontage, and I told him no, and he smiled at me like a man counting teeth. Watch him. Margaret Calder. Augusta read the note through twice. Then she set it aside and lifted the filing. It was a single folded sheet of heavy paper, yellowed at the edges, and when she opened it, the creases held like cloth. Water right, and creek frontage, entitlement, claimant Holt Calder, 160 acres, Hollis Creek drainage, filed this 9th day of June, 1862 *. Notary seal was pressed deep into the lower corner. Josiah Lamb had signed in a farmer's hand. The letters big and even. Reverend Coombs had signed in a smaller, sharper hand. Holt's own signature was younger than the man on the cot in the parlor by 23 years. She turned the sheet, and the territorial clerk's seal was on the back exactly where Margaret Calder had said it would be. The second envelope was thicker. She loosened the string, and a small drift of newspaper clippings spilled across the table. Some were a year old, some older. A notice from the Hollis Creek Bulletin announcing the formation of the Mesa Land and Survey Company, March of 1883. The same month Augusta noted, with the cold, steady part of her mind, that Margaret Calder had died of fever. A list of officers. A list of investors. And underneath the clippings 3 sheets of incorporation paper Margaret Calder had somehow obtained from somewhere. The county clerk, perhaps, or the territorial filing office in Las Vegas, listing the silent partners of Mesa Land and Survey, by name. The third name on the list was Aldous Marsh. Augusta sat very still. She had known Eleanor Brand at the Mercantile had told her, in so many quiet words, 2 weeks ago. The Creek Bend stake had told her. The vanished crew had told her. Tate's careless mouth at supper one night had told her, when he let slip that Marsh's foreman had been at the bunkhouse asking after Mr. Calder's health. She had known. But there is knowing, and there is holding the paper in your hand, with the man's name printed on it, under a notary seal, and these two are not the same thing. And Augusta sat for a long moment with the second thing in front of her and let it settle. Sure. Then she got up. She folded the filing again, along its old creases, and slid it into the inside pocket of her dress, against her ribs, where she could feel it. She put the incorporation papers and the clippings back into the envelope, and the envelope back into the tin box, and the tin box into the satchel she had brought from her room. She put the satchel on the chair by the parlor door. She turned down the kitchen lamp, but did not put it out. Then she went out across the yard to the barn. Tate had the bay saddled. He had also, without being asked, saddled the gray for himself, and he stood holding both sets of reins, in the lantern light, with his face wiped clean of everything that had been on it for 3 weeks. "Mr. Tate," she said, "ma'am, I need you to ride to town tonight." "Yes, ma'am." "You will go first to Mrs. Brand at the Mercantile. Wake her, if she is asleep. Tell her, Augusta Whitmore says it is time, and that I am asking her to put the word out at first light to every farm she trusts. Wheat to bring down at the Calder place, and a storm 2 days out, and anyone with a scythe or a wagon or a strong back is wanted by sunrise. Tell her exactly that." "Yes, ma'am." "Then you will ride to the county assessor. His name is Pell. He keeps a room above the land office. Wake him too. Tell him, Mr. Vert, Calder's housekeeper requests that he attend the land office hearing on Friday, and that she has documents he will want to see beforehand if he can come out to the homestead Thursday evening. Tell him she has the original 1862 filing and incorporation papers naming the silent partners of Mesa Land and Survey. Use those words: filing, incorporation, silent partners. Tate's eyes had gone wide somewhere in the middle of this. He swallowed. You want me to say all that to the assessor? I want you to say all that to the assessor. Word for word. Can you do it? Yes, ma'am. Say it back. He said it back. He stumbled at asterisk, incorporation, asterisk, and she made him say it again, and he said it the second time, without stumbling. Good, she said. Take water. Take the long coat. The wind will turn cold before you make town. Do not ride the bay down. Walk her up the hills. Yes, ma'am. He swung up into the saddle. He did not move the horse. He looked down at her with the lantern light cutting up under his hat, and his mouth worked once. And then he said, ma'am. About what I said. On the porch. The first day, Mr. Tate. Yes, ma'am. That is not the work tonight. He nodded once, hard, and turned the horse. And she heard the bay's hooves go down the lane and onto the road, and away, east, toward town. She stood in the barn doorway until she could not hear them any more. Then she went back to the house. She slept 3 hours on the chair, by Holt's cot. She had meant to sleep 4. The light woke her at the kitchen window before she meant to be woken, and she was up and at the stove before her body had finished agreeing to it. Coffee. Cornbread. From yesterday's pan. Salt pork. She set the table for as many men as the table would hold, and she did not yet know whether anyone would come. They came. The first wagon was on the road at 6, and by 7 there were 3 wagons in the yard and 4 saddle horses tied along the rail. By 8, there were 9 men in the kitchen, eating with their hats off, and 2 women with them. Mrs. Hollander from the place down the creek and her oldest girl, both with their sleeves already rolled, and Eleanor Brand herself climbed down out of the mercantile's delivery wagon, with a basket of bread and a face like a woman come to a wedding she had been waiting on for a long time. Eleanor took Augusta by both hands inside the kitchen door and looked at her for one long moment without saying anything. Then she said, I told them what you said. I told them whose wheat it was, and whose water, and whose porch. They came. Thank you. Eleanor. Tate found Pell at his window, with his lamp still on. Pell will be out tomorrow evening. He said tell you he has been waiting 4 years for someone to bring him paper on Mesa Land and Survey. Tell him I have paper. I told him already. Augusta fed them all. She fed the Hollanders and the Mitchell brothers and old Mr. Rectus. Reeves, who farmed the quarter section west, and his 2 grown sons, and the German family from the bench, whose name she could not yet say correctly, and who did not seem to mind. She fed them, and they ate fast and quiet the way men eat when there is light burning behind them. And then they went out into the field with their scythes and cradles, and the day's work began. Augusta went with them. She had put on her work dress, the dark heavy one, with the broad pockets, and over it the canvas apron that had hung on the peg by the back door, since Margaret Calder had left it there. The apron was a little tight across her shoulders. She did not mind. She walked out to the edge of the near 40 with a scythe she had taken down from the barn wall the night before and sharpened by lantern light on the bench. And she set her feet, and she swung. She had not swung a scythe in 9 years. Her father's farm in Missouri, the last summer before he died. Her body remembered before her mind did. The hips first, then the shoulders, then the long pull through the stroke and the lift on the back end. The wheat went down in front of her in a clean fall. After the first hour her hands knew what they were doing, and after the second hour her back had stopped complaining, and by noon she had cut a swath as wide as any of the men, and her face was wet under her bonnet, and her dress was dark with sweat at the small of her back, and she had not stopped once. The men noticed. They did not say anything. Out of the corner of her eye she saw the older Mitchell brother glance at her, and then glance at his brother, and the younger one give the smallest possible nod, and they bent back to their own rows. Mr. Braun Reeves stopped at the end of his row at one point, and stood watching her for a full minute, with his hand shading his eyes. Then he said, "Only Mrs. Whitmore," and went back to work, and Augusta did not correct him on the asterisk. Mrs. Asterisk, because there was no time, and because in the field, for that day. At noon she went up to the house, and put bread and meat and a pot of beans on the porch on the long board they had set up on sawhorses. And she rang the iron triangle, and they came in from the field, and ate standing and went back out again inside of 20 minutes. She carried a plate in to Holt. He was awake. He had been watching out the parlor window all morning. He looked at her in the doorway with her bonnet around her neck and her sleeves, dark to the elbow and her hair coming loose at the temples. And his face did something she had not seen it do before. "Eat," she said. "Augusta, eat first." He ate. She sat on the chair by the cot and drank a cup of water, and did not eat, because if she sat down to eat she would not get up again, and there was a field to go back to. She watched him eat. He watched her watch him. 42 acres, he said. "We took 8 this morning. 8. 8 by noon. The Mitchell boys cut like they were born to it. Mr. Reeves is slower, but he does not stop. The German family, I cannot say the name yet. Hofstetler. They have brought their own cradle, and it is better than ours. We will have 20, down by dark, if the wind holds off." He set the plate down. "Augusta." "Yes. I have not been a good employer to you." "You have been a fine employer." "I have been a man with one leg and a closed kitchen and a bottle of laudanum, and you have been the one running this place for 3 weeks. And now you are running my harvest, and I. Mr. Calder Holt, eat your dinner. We will talk on the porch when the wheat is in." She got up. At the doorway she stopped with her hand on the frame and did not turn around. "There is a rider coming up the lane," she said. "And daughter." She had heard him before she had seen him. She had been hearing for him since dawn. "It will be Marsh or one of his Augusta. Stay where you are." She went out onto the porch. It was Marsh himself. He had brought 2 men with him on horseback, and he had come up the lane at a walk so that the working neighbors in the field could see him coming from a long way off. And he reined in at the gate and sat his horse and looked at the porch, and Augusta stood at the porch rail and looked back at him. He was a man of middling size, with very clean clothes, and a soft pale face, and the sort of mustache that has been brushed every morning of its life. He took off his hat as if she were a lady at a parlor door. The 2 men behind him did not take off their hats. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. He had learned her name. She noted it. "Mr. Marsh. I am sorry to find Mr. Calder indisposed, are you?" He smiled at her the way a man smiles at a child who has said something pert. "I am here on a matter of survey. You will have seen the notice my rider delivered yesterday. The creek frontage and the attached water entitlement have been found by my company to lie outside the original Calder filing, and as such, revert to public allocation effective Friday next, at which point Mesa Land and Survey will be applying for the reallocation through proper channels at the land office in town." "I have seen the notice." "Then you understand." "I understand the notice. I do not agree with it." He laughed. It was a small, soft, pleasant laugh, and behind her in the field, the swinging of the sides did not stop, but slowed, the way a room slows when a voice goes up. The Mitchell brothers had straightened. Mr. Reeves had laid his blade down across the stubble and was walking up toward the fence. Eleanor Brand had come out from the kitchen and stood now at the corner of the porch, with a dish towel in her hands, and her face was the face of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this. "Mrs. Whitmore," Marsh said, "I am sure you mean well. I am sure Mr. Calder values your service in his household. But this is a matter for men with papers, and—" "I have papers," he stopped. "I beg your pardon, I have papers, Mr. Marsh." He looked at her a long moment. Something moved in his face that he did not quite catch in time. Then it was gone, and the soft pale composure was back. "Then I look forward to seeing them at the hearing on Friday." "You will?" "It would be a kindness to Mr. Calder," he said, "to allow him to consider a private offer before that hearing. The land will not hold its value once the water question is on the public record. I am prepared to be generous, Mr. Marsh." "Yes, you will get off this land." She said it without raising her voice. She said it the way she said "pass the salt" at the supper table. The two men behind Marsh shifted in their saddles. Mr. Reeves had come up to the porch rail now and stood beside her, not quite touching her, his hand resting on the rail with his thumb tapping once. Eleanor Brand had not moved. Marsh put his hat back on. "Friday, Mrs. Whitmore." "Friday, Mr. Seller." "Marsh." He turned his horse. At the gate he paused and looked back and gave her the small, soft, pleasant smile again, and he said, loud enough for the field to hear, "Mrs. Whitmore, you are a remarkable woman. It is a pity what is about to happen to you." And he rode off down the lane with his two men behind him, and the working neighbors watched him go, and then, without a word being spoken, they bent back to the wheat. Augusta stood at the porch rail until she could not see his hat anymore. Her hand was flat against the front of her dress where the filing lay against her ribs. She had not realized she was holding it there. She lowered her hand. "Mr. Furr?" Reeves cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitmore." "Mr. Reeves. There is 2 of my boys, and 3 of the Hofstetlers, and the Mitchell brothers, and myself, and we will be here Friday at the hearing, if you want us there." "I want you there." "Then we will be there." He went back down the steps and out into the field. Eleanor Brand came over and stood next to her at the rail. She did not speak for a moment. Then she said, "He called you Mrs. Whitmore." "He did." "He knows you are not married. He knows. He did it on purpose. He did, to see if it would shake you." "Yes." Eleanor looked at her sidelong. "It did not." "No, Augusta, yes?" "There has not been a woman in this town who stood up to that man in 8 years. There has been now." Eleanor put her hand briefly on Augusta's forearm, a single firm squeeze, and then took it away and went back into the kitchen to put more bread on. Augusta stood another moment with the wind moving across the porch, and the smell of cut wheat coming off the field, and the low hum of the men's voices out in the rows, and then she went down the steps and picked up her scythe where she had leaned it against the rail, and she went back to work. They cut until dark. They cut by lantern after dark for 2 more hours, until even the Mitchell brothers were stumbling, and then she sent them in. The Hollanders slept on the parlor floor, and the Mitchell brothers in the bunkhouse. Reeves and his boys went home to come back at first light, and the Hofstetlers stayed in their wagon under the cotton wood by the barn. Eleanor went back to town with a promise to bring 3 more men in the morning if she could find them. Augusta fed everyone again, more cornbread, more salt pork, a pot of beans that had been on the back of the stove all day. And then she sat down on the kitchen chair to take off her boots, and she fell asleep with 1 boot off and 1 boot on, and Holt's voice from the parlor woke her an hour later. "I am all right, come sit." She took off the other boot and went and sat by his cot in the dark. He found her hand. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Augusta." That storm is closer than 2 days. I know. What do we have? Down 26 acres. 16 to go, yes, in one day. Yes, he was quiet. His hand on hers was dry and very warm. If it breaks. Tomorrow night? It will not break tomorrow night, Augusta. It will break tomorrow afternoon. She had been watching the sky all day. She had been watching it the way her father had taught her to watch it. The long, slow way, the look at the horizon, and the look at the high cloud, and the look at the way the swallows turned. The storm was closer than Marcia's writer had said. The storm was closer than the almanac had said. The storm was coming in tomorrow before sundown, and she had 16 acres of wheat standing, and she had a county assessor riding out tomorrow evening, and a hearing on Friday, and a man in the parlor with a broken leg. And she set this all down in her mind in a row, and looked at it and did not flinch from any of it. Holt. Yes, I am going to need Tate at first light. I am going to need every hand. I am going to need to send one of the Hollander girls to ride for any man within 5 miles who has not yet come. Send her. I will, Augusta. Thank you. Sleep. She did not sleep. She sat in the chair by the cot until her head went down once against her shoulder and came up again, and then she got up and went to the kitchen and put the coffee on for morning, 2 hours early. And at 4 o'clock, she rang the iron triangle on the porch, and the Mitchell brothers came stumbling out of the bunkhouse, and the Hofstetlers came up out of their wagon, and the Hollanders sat up off the parlor floor. And by 4:30, Tate had come back in the night. She had not heard him come in. He was in the kitchen at 4, with his face washed, and his hair wet, and his hat in his hand, and he ate standing at the table, and would not look at her, and when she said, Mr. Tate, you are with me on the South 40 today, he said, Yes, ma'am, and went out and got his scythe, and that was all. The storm came in at 3 in the afternoon. She had said sundown, and she had been wrong by 3 hours, and she felt the wrongness in her shoulders and her gut when the sky over the west ridge went from white to lead in the space of 20 minutes. She did not stop. None of them stopped. Why? She had 8 acres standing when the first wind came down off the ridge, and the cottonwood by the barn turned its leaves silver, and she had 4 acres standing when the first fat warm drop hit the back of her hand, and she had 2 acres standing when Mr. Pend Reeves shouted from the upper end of the field, Mrs. Whitmore, we will not get the last of it. We will get the last of it. They got the last of it. She does not, afterward, remember how. She remembers Tate, beside her swinging a scythe, with his teeth set and his arms shaking and not stopping. She remembers Mrs. Brace Hofstetler driving the wagon up the row with her oldest boy, throwing sheaves into the bed as fast as they were tied. She remembers Eleanor Brand, who had come back out from town at noon with 3 more men and had not left, standing at the barn door receiving sheaves and stacking them and shouting at the Mitchell brothers in a voice that did not belong to a mercantile keeper. She remembers the rain holding off, holding off, holding off, the clouds sliding north along the ridge, as if some hand had laid a finger on it. And she remembers the last cradle of wheat going into the last wagon as the first hard crack of lightning broke over the bench, and the wagon coming into the barn at a run with the rain 20 feet behind it and catching them only as they slammed the doors. The rain came down then. It came down the way rain comes down in that country, when it has decided to. They stood in the barn in the lantern light with their clothes streaming and their hair flat against their heads and the wheat in stacks all around them to the rafters, 42 acres of it, every sheaf, and nobody said anything for a long moment. Then Mr. Reeves laughed once, a short surprised laugh, and the Mitchell brothers laughed, and Mrs. Hofstetler began to cry quietly into her apron, and Tate sat down on a hay bale and put his face in his hands. Augusta did not laugh. She did not cry. She walked the length of the barn once, between the stacks, and ran her hand along the side of one of them, feeling the heads, feeling the dryness of them, the weight of the grain. Then she went back to the door and stood looking out at the rain coming down across the yard where she had stood 3 weeks ago, with her satchel at her feet, and Tate's voice in her ear, about the boards not holding her, and she thought, calmly, that the boards had held. Pell, the county assessor, arrived in his buggy at 7 that evening, in the worst of the rain, with his coat over his head and his satchel under his arm. Augusta met him at the door. She had washed her face and changed her dress and put her hair up again. And she did not look like a woman who had been in the field for 30 hours. He came into the kitchen, and she sat him down at the long pine table and gave him coffee, and she laid the 1862 filing in front of him, and the incorporation papers beside it, and the clippings beside those, and she stood at the end of the table with her hands folded in front of her and let him read. He read for 20 minutes without speaking. He read the filing twice. He turned it over and looked at the territorial clerk's seal on the back and ran his thumb across it. He read the incorporation papers all the way through. He looked up at her once in the middle of the clippings and said only, "Margaret Calder did this." She did. She had been doing it for a year before she died. It looks that way. And he killed her. I do not believe he killed her, Mr. Pell. I believe she died of fever. But I believe he had been waiting for her to die for a long time, because she was the one in this house who would have seen him coming. Pell looked at the papers another moment. Then he looked up at her. "Mrs. Whitmore, I am going to tell you something I should not tell you. I have been trying to bring a case against Mesa Land and Survey for 3 years. I could not get a name. I could not get a silent partner. I could not get one piece of paper that would stand up in a hearing. You have brought me 4. I have brought you what Margaret Calder kept. You have brought it to me in time to use it. That is not the same as keeping it. That is the other half of the work. And it is the hard half. Friday, Mr. Pell. Friday. He stayed an hour. He took notes. Wall. He asked her 3 times whether she would be willing to lay the documents on the table herself at the hearing, rather than letting him present them on her behalf. And 3 times she said yes, she would. And the 3rd time he nodded slowly and said, "Mrs. Spreetimes, Whitmore, Mr. Marsh is going to come at you tomorrow morning the way a man comes at a fence. He means to break you. We'll need to stand still. I will stand still. He will say things about you. He has said things about me already. He will say worse. Mr. Pell. Yes. Men have been saying things about me since I was 11 years old. I know how to stand still." He looked at her then with something that was not pity, because she did not allow pity in the room, but something near it and better than it, and he picked up his hat. "I will see you at 9. 9. He went out into the rain. She slept that night 4 hours, which was more than she had slept the night before. And she woke at 5, and dressed in her best, the gray wool, the one with the high collar her mother had finished by hand the year before she died. And she put up her hair tight and pinned her mother's small jet brooch at her throat. And she put the tin box into the satchel, and the satchel onto the seat of the wagon. And at 7:30 she drove herself to town through mud the rain had left, with the sky washed clean, and the air smelling of cut wheat and wet earth, and the bay's breath steaming out white in the cold morning. Eleanor met her at the Mercantile. Mr. Reeves was there with both his sons. The Mitchell brothers were there. The Hofstettlers were there, in their black suits with their hair combed flat. Placent. There were others she did not yet know. A man with one arm who introduced himself as a neighbor of Reeves and said his name was Beaumont and that he had filed his own water claim on Hollis Creek in 1864 and would speak to that if she wished. And a thin, sharp woman in widow's gray who said only, "I knew Margaret. I will sit behind you," and sat down on a bench by the door without giving her name. At 9 they walked across the street to the land office. The room was packed. It held 40 when it was full, and it held 60 that morning, with men standing along the walls and against the back door. And Marsh was already at the long table at the front, in a fresh black coat, with 2 lawyers beside him, and a sheaf of survey maps weighted at the corners with brass paperweights. Pell sat at the small side table with his ledger open. The territorial assessor, a thin man Augusta did not know, sat at the front desk with his hands folded. Augusta walked up the center aisle with her satchel. She did not look at Marsh. She set the satchel on the table at the front and sat down in the chair Pell pointed her to, and she folded her hands in her lap. Marsh's lawyer began. He spoke for 20 minutes. He spoke very well. He laid out the survey his company had performed in May, the markers, the measurements, the conclusion that the original Calder filing of 1862 had described the creek frontage in language too vague to hold against modern survey method, and that as a consequence the water entitlement reverted by territorial statute to public allocation, and that Mesa Land and Survey was applying for reallocation through the proper channels. He said the words, proper channels, 4 times. He laid the survey map on the table, and the territorial assessor leaned forward and looked at it. The territorial assessor said, "Mr. Calder is not present." "Mr. Calder," Marsh said, rising smoothly, "is indisposed. He has sent his housekeeper." A small sound went through the room. Augusta did not turn her head. "His housekeeper," the territorial assessor said. "Yes. And is there a representative for Mr. Calder's interest who is not the housekeeper?" Pell rose. "I am here on behalf of the county, sir, with documents that bear on the question, Mrs. Whitmore is here in possession of those documents, and is authorized by Mr. Calder to present them." "Authorized, yes, sir." "In what form?" "In the form of a written instrument signed by Mr. Calder yesterday, in the presence of myself and Mrs. Eleanor Brand of Brand's Mercantile." He laid the paper on the desk. The territorial assessor read it. He looked up at Augusta. "Mrs. Whitmore, yes, sir, you have documents." "I do, sir, you may approach." She stood, she did not hurry. She picked up the satchel, and walked the 4 steps to the front desk, and opened the satchel, and took out the tin box. And she set the tin box on the desk, and she opened it. She took out the filing first. She unfolded it along its old creases, and laid it flat on the desk, in front of the territorial assessor. And she said, "This is the original water rights filing, dated the 9th of June, 1862. The claimant is Holt Calder. The witnesses are Josiah Lamb and Reverend Coombs. The notary is the territorial clerk at Fort Bascom, whose seal is on the back. Mr. Jolie, Calder's wife Margaret Calder, kept this filing in a tin box in the kitchen of the Calder homestead from the year of her marriage until her death of fever in March of 1883. I found it there 3 weeks ago." The territorial assessor picked the filing up. He turned it over. He looked at the seal. He took a small lens from his pocket and looked at the seal through it. He set the filing down. "Mr. Marsh's survey," he said, "claims this filing's description of the creek frontage is too vague to hold." "Mr. Marsh's survey," Augusta said, "did not see this filing. Mr. Marsh's survey worked from a copy on file at the county that is dated 1871 and that omits the schedule of meets and bounds attached to the original. The schedule is on the second sheet here." She turned the filing over and lifted the second leaf, which she had not unfolded yet, and she laid it flat. "The meets and bounds are described to the rod. They are not vague." The territorial assessor read the second leaf. "Well?" He read it twice. He looked up at Marsh. "Mr. Marsh." Marsh was on his feet. "Sir, that document has not been authenticated." "I will authenticate it now," Pell said. He had risen. He had a second paper in his hand. "I have here a sworn affidavit from the territorial clerk's office at Fort Bascom, confirming the seal and the signatures. It was telegraphed to me yesterday afternoon, and the original is following by mail." The territorial clerk himself remembers Josiah Lamb. He was 9 years old that summer, and he held the inkwell. Marsh sat down. Augusta turned back to the tin box. She took out the second envelope. She did not look at Marsh. She did not look at the room. She laid the incorporation papers of Mesa Land and Survey on the desk in front of the territorial assessor, and she put her finger on the third name on the schedule of silent partners, and she said, "This is the incorporation schedule of Mesa Land and Survey Company. It was filed in March of 1883. The third name is Aldous Marsh." The room did not make a sound. The territorial assessor looked at the paper, then he looked at Marsh. Then he looked back at the paper. "Mr. Marsh." Marsh was very pale. He stood up slowly. "Sir, that document is the incorporation filing of your survey company. It bears the seal of the Territorial Filing Office. Do you deny that you are the third name on this schedule?" Marsh did not answer. "Mr. Marsh, sir, do you deny it?" "I do not deny it, sir. But I will say that the relationship is, Mr. Marsh, a surveyor, who is a silent partner in the company that performs the survey, and who stands to benefit personally from the reallocation that the survey recommends, has a conflict that the territorial statute does not permit. Your survey is void. Your application for reallocation is denied. The transfer is frozen. The water entitlement remains with the original Calder filing of 1862. Mrs. Whitmore, please collect your documents." Augusta did not move. She let the words sit in the room. She let the men along the walls and against the back door hear them, and she let Marsh hear them, and she let Marsh's 2 lawyers hear them. And then she lifted the filing carefully and folded it back along its creases and put it back into the tin box, and she put the incorporation papers in after it, and she closed the tin box. Eleanor Brand stood up. "Sir," Eleanor said. The territorial assessor looked at her. "Mrs. Brand, I would like to say one thing before this room empties." "Say it." Eleanor stepped out into the aisle. She did not look at Marsh either. She looked at the men along the walls. The Mitchell brothers, Mr. Dasher, Reeves, the Hofstetlers, Beaumont, and the others. And she looked at the territorial assessor. And she looked finally at Augusta, who was still standing at the front desk with her hands folded over the tin box. "I knew Margaret Calder," Eleanor said. "She was my friend for 19 years. She kept those papers because she saw what was coming, and she did not have a husband she could tell, because Holt Calder is a man who does not like to be told things. She kept them in a kitchen because that was the room of the house that was hers. She died before she could use them. For 2 years they sat behind a stove in a closed kitchen, and a man." And here she did look at Marsh, and her voice did not change. "A man bled this homestead, and waited for a widower to break, and might have had the land cheap by Christmas if a woman had not come up the road on a stage 3 weeks ago, and turned the key in that kitchen door." She paused. "I have heard things said about Mrs. Whitmore in this town. I have heard them at my counter, and on the street, and on the church steps, and I will tell you plainly that I have heard them said by men in this room. About her size, about her plainness, about what she could or could not do. I will tell you what she has done. She has fed the men of this homestead 9 at a time for 23 nights. She has set the books in order. She has read the soil and the sky correctly when no one else in the county did. She has brought 42 acres of wheat down in 3 days with neighbors. She called in herself and one boy who shamed himself, and worked beside her, till he could not stand, and she did it in front of a storm that broke 6 hours early. And then she rose this morning at 5, and put on her gray dress and drove herself to town, with a tin box on the seat beside her. And she has done in this room, 20 minutes, what the county has been trying to do for 3 years. Eleanor stopped. Margaret Calder kept those papers, she said. Augusta Whitmore used them. I will not stand here and let this town pretend it cannot see her. She sat down. For a long moment nobody spoke. Reeves at the back of the room said very quietly, "Hear, hear," and the Mitchell brothers said it after him, and the territorial assessor cleared his throat and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, the transfer is frozen. The water remains with the Calder filing. The survey company will be under investigation by this office beginning Monday. You may go." She went. Marsh did not look at her as she walked past his table. He sat very still with his hands flat on the survey map, and his face the color of skimmed milk, and one of his lawyers was already gathering his papers. By the time she reached the door of the land office, she could hear the second lawyer behind her speaking in a low, quick voice to Marsh, and the words she caught were asterisk, withdraw, asterisk, and asterisk, immediate, asterisk, and asterisk, separate ourselves, and she did not turn her head. The neighbors followed her out. They did not speak in the street. They walked her to the wagon, and Mr. Reeves handed her up to the seat, and Eleanor climbed up beside her, and the Mitchell brothers fell in on horseback alongside, and they rode back out to the homestead together, along a road that smelled of wet wheat and earth, and the sun came out by the time they turned in at the Calder gate. Holt was on the porch. He had insisted on being moved out there. He sat in the wicker chair with his splinted leg propped on a footstool, and a blanket across his lap, and his face, when she came up the steps, was the face of a man who had been listening to the road for 4 hours. The neighbors did not come up onto the porch. They tipped their hats and rode on, each to his own place, and Eleanor squeezed Augusta's hand on the bottom step and said, "Tomorrow," and went back down to the wagon with the Mitchell brothers to drive her into town. Tate, who had been waiting in the yard with his hands in his pockets, took the bay's reins without being asked, and walked her around to the barn. Augusta came up the porch steps alone. She set the tin box on the small table by Holt's chair. She did not sit down yet. She stood at the porch rail and looked out across the cut field. The long rows of stubble running away east toward the creek, and the creek beyond them flashing in the late sun, where the channel ran open and clean. Tate had gone out at dawn before she had left for town and reopened the irrigation gate at the upper end with a shovel and a pry bar, and the water had come down through the field overnight, the way water had come down through it for 23 years. "It is done," she said. "Tell me." She told him. She told him in plain order the filing and the seal and the second leaf, and the incorporation schedule, and the third name, and the territorial assessor's face, and Eleanor on her feet in the aisle, and Holt listened without speaking, and when she was finished he reached up and took her hand off the porch rail and held it. "Augusta, yes. Sit down." She sat down on the chair beside him. He did not let go of her hand. He looked at her for a long time, and she let him. He had not looked at her like this before. He had looked at her with respect for 3 weeks, and with quiet gratitude for 2 days, and with something near love for an hour or so at a time, but he had not looked at her like this. "I am going to say it plain," he said. "I am not a man for the long way around it, and you are not a woman for it either. No, stay, Holt. Stay. Marry me. Put your name on this place beside mine. Run the books. Open that kitchen and keep it open. I will not ask you to be smaller than you are, and I will not ask you to be quieter than you are, and I will not ask you to be anything other than what you have been on this porch, since the morning you stepped down off that stage. I am asking you to stay." She did not answer for a moment. She looked down at his hand around hers, the long brown fingers, the cracked knuckle on the second one, the place on the back of the wrist, where the rope had burned him last fall. "I have conditions," she said. "Name them." "My name on the deed beside yours, not under, beside." "Yes, my hand on the ledgers, mine and no one else's." "You do not write a check, I have not seen." "Yes, the kitchen stays open." "Ah." "Margaret's kitchen. We do not close it again." "Yes." "Tate stays on. If he can learn to call me by my name, if he cannot, he goes. I will not have a man under this roof who calls me by a name that is meant to make me smaller. He will learn. He will learn, or he will go. That is a condition. Yes, one more. Yes, you will not flinch at me. Not in the dark, and not in the light, and not in front of company. I have been looked at sideways my whole life, by men who thought a woman my size was a comedy. You looked at me square on the day I stepped down off that stage, and you have looked at me square every day since, and I will not have it any other way. His hand tightened around hers. Augusta. Yes. I'm not most men. He had said it once before. He had said it the first week, very quietly, in the kitchen, when she had told him what Tate had said to her at the porch about the boards. She had not answered him then. She answered him now. "I know," she said. She turned her hand over inside his and laid her other hand on the side of his face, the rough place at his jaw, where he had not been able to shave for 4 days. And she held it there. He closed his eyes. She did not say anything else. The wind came up across the cut field, and turned the stubble silver, and rose against the porch, and lifted a loose piece of her hair off her temple, and she sat on the porch of the Calder homestead, with her hand on the face of the man she had come 3 weeks ago to cook for, and she did not flinch, and he did not flinch. That was the whole of it. They were married in October at the homestead, with Eleanor Brand standing for her, and Mr. Bling Reeves standing for him, and the Hofstetlers and the Mitchell brothers and the Hollanders and Beaumont and the thin, sharp woman in widow's gray, who turned out to be named Catherine Coombs, and to have been Reverend Coombs's daughter, all in the yard with their hats off. Holt walked on a cane. He would walk on a cane for the rest of his life. He did not mind. Tate stood at the back of the yard with his own hat in his hand, and called her Asterisk. Called her Asterisk for the first time when she came down, off the porch, on Holt's arm. And Augusta nodded to him once, and he nodded back, and the matter was settled between them and never spoken of again. The wheat sold honest weighted in November, at a price that paid the year's account and the doctor's bill, and a new harrow, and left enough over to put in oats, on the South 40 in the spring. The creek ran through reopened channels, and into the spring melt and out the other side. And when the runoff came in March, the water entitlement Margaret Calder had kept in her tin box was the first water down the line in Hollis Creek drainage, as it had been since 1862, and would be for as long as a Calder stood on the porch. Messaland and survey was wound up by the Territorial Assessor's Office before Christmas. The 2 lawyers separated themselves the day after the hearing, as the second one had wanted, and they did not appear in town again. The survey company's holdings were sold at auction to satisfy a list of small farmers Pell had been quietly compiling for 3 years, and most of them got back what had been taken. Marsh himself was seen less and less through the winter. By February, he was not seen at all. One morning in late February, when the snow was crusted hard in the yard and the cottonwood by the barn was black against the white, there came a knock at the kitchen door. Augusta was at the stove. She had baked 4 loaves that morning, and they were cooling on the rack, and the kitchen smelled of bread and wood smoke and the coffee on the back burner. She wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door. Marsh stood on the step. He was thin. His coat was the same coat he had worn to the land office hearing in September, and it hung on him now as if it had been made for a larger man. His mustache had not been brushed. His face was the color of paper. He did not speak. He did not lift his eyes to her face. Augusta looked at him a moment. Then she turned back into the kitchen. She went to the pantry. She took down a clean flour sack from the shelf, and she scooped flour into it from the barrel, 4 good scoops, and she folded the top of the sack and tied it with twine, and she came back to the door. She held it out to him. He took it. He did not look up. His hands shook around the sack, and he held it against his chest, as if it were something he had to keep warm. And he turned without a word, and went down the step and across the yard. And Augusta watched him go past the cottonwood, and out the gate, and away down the road toward town with the sack against his chest. She closed the door. She went back to the stove. She set the coffee pot forward over the heat. From the parlor Holt called, "Who was at the door?" "No one," she said. "A man come to the wrong house." She heard him grunt once, and shift the cane against the chair, and then the house was quiet again. The slow tick of the kitchen clock, and the low draw of the stove, and the small settling sound the loaves made as they cooled. And Augusta stood at the kitchen window, with her hands on the sill, and looked out across the white yard at the road where the man had gone. She thought about Margaret Calder. She thought about a woman who had kept a tin box behind a stove for a year and had not lived to use it, and who had written a note that began asterisk, "If anyone ever questions the water asterisk," and had folded it and laid it on top of a filing dated 1862, and had trusted, against every reason a woman in that country had not to trust, that someone would one day open the box. She thought about herself at 11 years old in a schoolyard in Missouri, and at 17 at her father's grave, and at 24 turning down a man in St. Joseph, who had told her she should be grateful for the offer. She thought about Tate on the porch saying the boards might not hold her, and she thought about Marsh in the land office, calling her Mrs. Whitmore, the way you would put a finger on a bruise. She thought about Eleanor Brand standing in the aisle saying, "Asterisk, I will not stand here and let this town pretend it cannot see her." Asterisk, she had been seen, she thought she had been seen on a porch, by a man who did not flinch. She had been seen in a field by neighbors who came when they were called. She had been seen in a land office by an assessor, who picked up a filing and turned it over in his hand. She had been seen by a friend who had stood up. She had not been invisible. She had only, all her life, been standing in rooms with people who had refused to see, and she had walked, at last, into a room where the seeing was done. That was the whole turn of it. The world had not learned to look. One porch had, one kitchen had, one county had. In one morning, in front of 40 men. It was enough. It was, she understood now, with her hands flat on the sill, and the bread cooling behind her, and the man with the sack of flour gone down the road. More than most women got, and she would not waste a single hour of it. She turned from the window. She took down the ledger from the shelf by the stove, and opened it on the long pine table, and uncapped the pen, and she began to enter the morning's accounts in her own steady hand, her name written at the head of the page beside his, and the kitchen door behind her standing open to the parlor where her husband sat by the fire, and the water in the creek, and the deed in the strong-box. Upstairs with her name on it, beside his plane, the side, not under, beside. The way she had set it on the porch, in September. The way it would stand from this morning forward, every acre of it earned, every line of it hers.